and welcome to Macros with Mythili, where we take a hard look at some of the major recent macroeconomic developments in India and abroad. Today we're going to take a hard look at the newly constituted Niti Aayog. Much has already been written and said about the Aayog, so what we're going to try and do is look at it from an economic rather than a political economy perspective, that is, view it through an economic prism. Is it curtains for planning as we knew it all along? What does the Aayog really mean for fiscal federalism and resource transfers, for centrally sponsored schemes? And to discuss all this, I have with me a panel of three eminent economists. Dr. C. Rangarajan, Chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council under the UPA government, Sudha Pillai, former Member Secretary to the Planning Commission, and Pradeep Mehta, founder of the Jaipur-based CUTS, which is at the forefront of the debate on reforming the Planning Commission. Welcome to the show. Dr. Rangarajan, if I may start with you, let me start with a quote from Joe Stiglitz. He says, "The issue is not whether planning is needed, it surely is, but whether the most effective place to do the planning is in a government centralized bureau or at the level of the firm." Today, most economists are skeptical about the ability of a centralized bureau to do effective planning. Would you agree with that assessment, Dr. Rangarajan? Do you think we've moved away from the times of the rigid second five-year plan of the Malunibus type, and we need to move into a far more decentralized system of planning in a market-driven economy?
Well, planning itself is undergoing a lot of change. Obviously, the kind of planning that we were doing in the mid-50s and 60s and 70s has no relevance now. That was a time when the state was a dominant partner in the economic programs, and therefore the kind of planning that we did at that time may be consistent with the thinking at that time, but certainly it's no longer relevant. In fact, even when the 8th plan was being written, I think for the period 92-97, we moved away, as far as the private sector of the system is concerned, and moved towards indicative planning as far as the private sector is concerned. Therefore, the role of the private sector will continue to rise in the Indian economy. That is the basis of the new liberalization policy. But even then, the government will play an important part. And therefore, what I think the role of the new commission should be not so much in terms of planning and fixing the targets for every sector of the economy, but on the other hand, trying to look at the broad issues that arise in the growth process, the strategies that we need to adopt in terms of achieving a higher growth rate. These are the things that the commission should take up and look at. The kind of fixing, as I mentioned, physical targets for every conceivable sector of the economy is no longer valid, and it is not also possible because the system itself has undergone change. But given the fact that the state itself is still a major part, and the program of the state over the next 5 years in many areas need to be outlined. And for that also, you need a commission or need an institution which can specify the policy directions in which the government should move.
Pradeep, Dr. Rangarajan talked about the need for a change role for planning, and the late Dr. Amiresh Bagchi had also argued that in a market-driven economy, planning must be indicative, prescriptive, and must try to attempt coordination between the states. Would you agree with that assessment? Because you yourself have been arguing for a long time for a think tank kind of role for the erstwhile Planning Commission. But mind you, we have a number of government-funded think tanks. We have NIPFP, we have IIFT, we have IDSA. So is there a role for another government-funded think tank? What is it going to achieve?
I agree with what Dr. Rangarajan spoke, and the idea of a central omnibus holistic think tank does not exist at the moment. And the names that you mentioned are not; they are all very, much more narrower in their remit as against the role which one would expect the Niti Aayog to play.
Sudha, you've been an insider in the Planning Commission for many years. As far as the erstwhile Planning Commission was concerned, what is the single biggest drawback from the point of fiscal federalism as far as the states were concerned?
I think the basic problem vis-a-vis fiscal federalism was that the states felt that they were actually just on the receiving end of a prescription or a formula or something that was actually dictated to them. They never felt that they were partners in a discussion which would lead to agreed ways of doing things or agreed initiatives in order to combat the various problems that this large and wonderful country faces.
Pradeep, one of the singular things if you go through the notification of the government is that it's completely silent on the role of resource allocation. Now, if the Niti Aayog does not have any role to play in resource allocation, does this take away greatly from the role that the Aayog could play? Does it become a toothless body?
I don't think so. See, resource allocation in a sense has been the bugbear and something which goes against the whole concept of fiscal federalism, as Sudha too argued. See, the states never felt that they could do the way they would like in terms of priorities of their own. And generally it was a kind of a top-down approach which naturally reduced the space for that fiscal federalism as is envisaged. If you look at any other federal country, you will find that the provinces or the states have a much more bigger role to play in terms of how they decide on the allocation of resources within their own province / state. And that is something which is what we hope that it will continue. Now, if the Niti Aayog is not involved with resource allocation, I would imagine at least they would be able to give the policy directions on the basis of an evolved consensus, as the body has now been designed to be a representative body of all the states, including having zonal councils. And therefore one imagines that the main focus, if you expand the word Niti, the word transformation is the critical role that I expect the Niti Aayog to play in terms of transformation, looking at expanding the growth pie, and in sync with what the states also feel is necessary and to be addressed at their own levels, depending on their own endowments and their needs.
Dr. Rangarajan, Pradeep just talked about the importance of resource allocation in a federation, and the fact is that every federation you do have vertical as well as horizontal imbalances between your responsibilities and the kind of resources you have. And Article 280 of the Constitution talks about a finance commission to decide the devolution of tax revenue, it mentions. Now, you've been a chairman of a finance commission, you've also been a member of the Planning Commission. How do you see these two playing out? Can we think of the Finance Commission extending its role to more than tax revenue, looking at all the resources? Is it feasible?
I have looked at the quantum and the composition of the resource transfers from the center to the states. Even as of the latest year, 60% of the transfers are because of the Finance Commission. Actually, the Gadgil formula type of transfers amount only to less than 3% of the total. The centrally sponsored schemes constitute another about 30 to 35%. Therefore, giving this responsibility to the Finance Commission is an easy task. Actually, we are talking about a very small part of the total transfers from the center to the states. After all, the Finance Commission also adopts a formula which is based on equity and other considerations. Therefore, I do not see any particular role being played by the new commission in terms of resource allocation. I think the resource allocation should be left entirely to either to the Finance Commission, or if a formula is evolved, then the Finance Ministry can, according to the formula, distribute the funds. Therefore, I personally think that the work is best done by the Finance Commission, and we are actually exaggerating the role played by the Planning Commission in resource allocation. It is only a very, very small part of the total.
Dr. Rangarajan, I'll come back to the issue of the Finance Commission, but after a very short break. But please do stay with us. We'll be back very soon. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the role of the Niti Aayog from the point of view of economic planning and what it means for fiscal federalism. Dr. Rangarajan, before the break, you were talking about the Finance Commission and how the Finance Commission, to your mind, is eminently suited to look at the entire issue of resource transfer, not just tax, but including non-tax also. But how does one go about this? Does one make the Finance Commission a permanent body? Because currently it is not a permanent body as per the Constitution. So the Constitution will need to be amended. Secondly, the Finance Commission doesn't have any representation from the states in the Commission. Will that be a drawback in the new scheme of things where we're thinking in terms of cooperative federalism?
No, I don't think that there is a need for a permanent body. After all, if the Finance Commission today can determine 60% of the transfers to be occurred during a 5-year period, adding another 2 or 3% or even another 5%, which is all what the Planning Commission is now doing, can be done by the Finance Commission even as it is constituted now. Therefore, I don't see the need for a permanent body from this angle. As far as the representation is concerned, I think nothing prevents the Finance Commission, nothing prevents the Government of India, while constituting the Finance Commission, to have appropriate representatives from the state. In the past also, they have included finance secretaries or from the states in the Finance Commission. Therefore, the composition is something that can be decided by the government, taking into account the strong feelings that have emerged in terms of the representation for the states. In fact, deviating from this, I had in fact suggested, even when the present type of Planning Commission was in operation, that some representatives, some chief ministers of states could also be included in the Planning Commission. After all, the Planning Commission, as it has been operating until now, had central ministers. It would have been an ideal thing to have included some chief ministers, at least by rotation, in the Planning Commission. That would have given the states the feeling that they are also part of a national plan.
Pradeep, Dr. Rangarajan said in fact that a permanent Finance Commission is not even necessary. But do you think the Finance Commission can take on the entire role of devolution of resources, tax as well as non-tax, between the union and the states and inter-say between the states? Is that the role that we can envisage for the Finance Commission of the future?
I would. And Mythili, more importantly, if you look at the evolution of institutions in India, Finance Commission is a constitutional body, and therefore it can be much more autonomous and arm's length from the government. The point which I made a little earlier was, Niti Aayog is something new, and it has to evolve, and there is there is no bar on the Finance Commission working in partnership with Niti Aayog in terms of the allocation of resources, depending on the kind of policy prescriptions which the Niti Aayog is going to come about. And mind you, the Niti Aayog is going to be a representative body of all the states. So you can find a way. Let us try to see as to how the Niti Aayog evolves. And this could be one very clear role in terms of the policy prescriptions translating into allocation of resources.
Sudha, we were talking about the distinction between plan and non-plan. There's been a lot of argument about, what is plan, what is non-plan. Is it an artificial distinction? Is it getting blurred? What are your views on that? And does the setting up of a Niti Aayog change this entire way in which we've been doing things in the past?
Well, I hope so, because way back in July 2011, a committee headed by none other than Dr. Rangarajan actually gave a report which said that actually distortions had crept in by this very invidious and illogical distinction between plan and non-plan expenditure, and that it was actually coming in the way of efficient management of expenditure. You see, when you look at the overall, if you look at the country as a whole, whether it is central finances or state finances, resources which are raised by the center under powers that are vested in the center or by the states, you need to actually become more efficient. At this point of time, this distinction between plan and non-plan, because plan is nothing but it just says what is actually listed in the plan as investment and development outlays, and it can even be salaries of people, whereas the non-plan expenditure actually sometimes has suffered because you have actually relegated it to a secondary place, and maintenance of assets created under the plan have also suffered. So you really need to look at the total picture of what is actually needed in the country, what kind of resources we have, what are the hurdles that we face, and what kind of management that we should bring about. And I think at this point of time, this present organization is ideally suited for that, in the sense that let's not forget about the fact that there is an annual budget, and that annual budget itself is a statement both on behalf of the state governments in the state budgets and the central budget of what the government perceives as its desirable goals and what kind of signals it's trying to give to the economy, both public and private sectors as such.
Dr. Rangarajan, Sudha mentioned the annual budget. In fact, that has been one of the criticisms of the earlier system, that there was a complete disconnect between the annual budget of the finance minister announced in February and the plan. Now, will that kind of disconnect cease to exist with the doing away of the planning commission as it were? Number one. And number two, this distinction between plan and non-plan that Sudha elaborated, is that also a relic of the past which will hopefully disappear? How relevant is it in today's scenario?
I think the committee to which Sudha mentioned went into this issue at great length, actually the proper distinction is between revenue expenditure and capital expenditure. This distinction between plan and non-plan, whatever its origin, has certainly resulted in a situation in which you have hospitals without doctors, schools without teachers, because one is treated as plan and the other is treated as non-plan expenditure. But going ahead, I do not know whether the new commission will look at some kind of an annual plan and the budget being linked with it. It may not necessarily be doing that job at all. It may be the work of the finance ministry itself. Therefore, if the main function of the new commission is basically to lay out policy prescriptions, strategies for growth and so on, I think the allocations for each ministry, each department can be worked out in the context of the overall policy framework between the ministry and the finance ministry. I perhaps do not see the new commission coming into the picture at all. Therefore, the question of coordinating an annual plan with the budget may not be the concern at all, and perhaps we may move away from that.
Okay, so we may move away from the concept of an annual plan and an annual budget, but I'm afraid on that note we have to slip into another very short break, but please do stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Macros with Mythili, and we're discussing the Niti Aayog from the perspective of economic planning, the future of economic planning in the country, and what it means for fiscal federalism. Sudha, before the break, there was extensive discussion on the Finance Commission and how the Finance Commission can perhaps do the entire business of resource transfer. But Article 263 of the Constitution also has a provision for an interstate council. Why has that interstate council not really, lived up to what was expected perhaps by the Constitution framers? And could that council have done this business of resource transfers?
Actually, the constitutional mandate for the interstate council has nothing to do with resource transfers. It has everything to do with the issues that might arise between states or between states and the center. And it's actually the most exciting part of the Niti Aayog for me is this marriage of Article 263, which describes what the interstate council has to do. And frankly, many of the items on the agenda, which are very long pending items, have never actually been handled.
Pradeep, two other very contentious issues really were that of, one, I'll ask you about the special category status of states. If you remember, before the elections, there was this huge demand from Bihar wanting a special category status. Now, who will play that role of deciding which are the states to be put in special category?
Well, as I said, I visualize a future where the Niti Aayog would have to work in sync with the Finance Commission, and jointly they could look at this particular issue rather than leaving it on the central government, where a state may not feel that it would get justice the way it has hoped for. And going on to the other point which you spoke with Sudha, I mean, this is again a bit of a confusion about what would be the, there is a kind of a parallel track zonal council in the interstate council set up as well as proposed in the Niti Aayog. And as I said, I think the architecture of Niti Aayog would evolve as it moves along. And I would be also very strongly in favor of making it a statutory body rather than to remain as a government, as a resolution of the government, as was one of the criticisms faced by the Planning Commission, that it doesn't have any statutory status.
Dr. Rangarajan, since there's so much riding on, this category, special category states, should that be something that is decided by the Finance Commission, by the Niti Aayog, or something like the NDC? And again, secondly, what happens to centrally sponsored schemes?
Well, the special category states now enjoy certain privileges, if you want to call them. And certainly the new commission, along with all the chief ministers, can decide on which states can enjoy a special status because of the peculiar situation or circumstances. And therefore, I would think that the concept of special category status, if it is to be continued, is something that should be determined in relation to each state by this new body. Certainly, I believe that the resource allocation is something that can be best left to the Finance Commission. I hold strongly that view.
Pradeep, your final comments on how is the Niti Aayog better than the earlier system? Is it more or less status quo? And I'm talking from the perspective of economic growth, economic planning, fiscal federalism especially.
Yeah, I first of all wholeheartedly endorse what Dr. Rangarajan said. And again I reiterate that the Finance Commission is a constitutional body, and therefore it would have a much more leeway in deciding on resource allocation.
So that Dr. Rangarajan felt there's not very much difference between the composition of the earlier Planning Commission and the Niti Aayog. But would you go along with that, or would you think the Niti Aayog is seen, the way it's constituted, as it's a far more representative and a far more democratic body? What is your view?
I think it's a forum for states to come forward with their woes, with their difficulties and the problems that they encounter vis-a-vis central government, and a place where actually decisions can be taken or a view can be taken. A decision may not necessarily be the right word, but a view can emerge on what would be the right path to take. But I want to qualify, I was Finance Secretary in the Government of Kerala for 3 years, and my difficulties were with the Planning Commission and annual difficulty. But my difficulties with the centrally sponsored schemes were daily problems, because here we were actually put in a straitjacket, and even though our resources, our requirements, our conditions were very different from, let us say, even the neighboring states, we had to fit in within a particular discipline. And I feel that fiscal federalism will come about only when the centrally sponsored schemes are looked at, and possibilities of greater flexibility and a greater say in how all those monies which are transferred to the states in a very narrow, straight-jacketed way are looked at and change brought about.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this edition of Macros with Mythili. We've been discussing the Niti Aayog and what it means for economic planning and fiscal federalism. Clearly, the panelists feel that the time of rigid planning, centralized kind of planning is over. We need to have a new kind of planning mechanism in place, which is much more participative and much less centralized. On the issue of how resource transfer should be done, I think Dr. Rangarajan was fairly emphatic that it could be done by the Finance Commission alone. There's no need for any other body. Pradeep was a little bit more guarded, and Sudha, of course, we did not ask her specifically on this, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have in this edition. Thank you so much, Dr. Rangarajan, Pradeep, as well as Sudha. Thank you also for watching. But we'll be back next week with yet another edition of Macros with Mythili. Till then, it's thank you and goodbye from all of us at ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.